Good day to you. Welcome to your next session of Revival Not Survival. And today I have titled this session, Living a Life That Inspires Revival, because we're speaking about having revival in our own lives. That's what the whole idea of this group is. Not just looking for revival happening around us in the world, but starting in our own lives, that we have a personal revival and awakening in our relationship with Jesus, a stirring in our prayer life, an expectation to hear from God, living this adventurously expectant life, and having a boldness in our faith. And so when we have that personal revival, your life is going to inspire revival in the life of someone else. So what I've done is I've taken some from some points from my book, Your Now Season, and the chapter, I just want to have a look for it. The chapter is actually Called for Revival and Not Survival. And so I've got some pointers in here, how to live a life that inspires revival. And don't you want to be the person who is walking, no matter what the circumstances are around you, that you're walking in this place where you know that God has spoken to you, or people can see an unshakable faith in you, they can see a boldness in you when you get together to pray. You're ready to pray, you're ready with a word in your mouth. And even if you don't have a word in your mouth, if you say, I'm not hearing from God, there's an expectation in your heart because you know God is good and He's not going to let you down. So those are the people I want to be around, and that's the kind of person I want to be. And so let's look at the first one is pointers to live a life that inspires revival. The first one is don't apologize for what you believe. There are going to be people around you who are going to say you are crazy to have faith. You're crazy to think that you're going to make a difference. You know, people who have prayed things and they're still waiting, so they're a little bit skeptical, and then you come along and you say, God said this, and let's get together and pray, and let's prophesy and do all kinds of things, and they're going to think you're crazy, and they're going to try and talk you out of it, just like the spies who went into the promised land. Joshua and Caleb were those guys who didn't apologize for what they believed. They stood up because they said, if God is with us, if God delights in us, and they knew God did. And the rest of them were so focused on the problems, the challenges, that they could not agree with them. It says in Numbers chapter 14, from verse 6 onwards, you can read it. It says this, I will just read you the beginning of it, because these two guys, Joshua and Caleb, were fully persuaded that God was with them, and that when God promised something, He was going to keep them and fulfill that promise. And it says here, but Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes, and they spoke, aren't you glad we don't have to tear our clothes today? They spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, the land we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, then He will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. But the rest of them, they were weeping and crying, and they were so focused on the problem. Now, I want to say to you, when God has said something to you and you can see your promised land, you're going to see the opposition and the challenges. But when you're the kind of person who knows that God is with you, you don't have to say, God said this, but you are fully persuaded that God is with you. He's able to keep you. He's able to do what He promised. Then don't apologize for that. Just stand your ground and say, this is what I believe. The next one is, always have the word nevertheless in your vocabulary. Nevertheless is something that changes the situation. When you get an instruction from God and it's not logical, it doesn't make sense, it's too difficult for you, but you're willing to say nevertheless at your word, like the guys in Luke chapter 5, when the fishermen who had packed up, and Jesus said to them, launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch. And then Simon says, we've toiled all night and caught nothing. And then he says, nevertheless, at your word, I let down the net. If you're willing to say, God, I don't understand why you're telling me to do this. I don't understand why you are telling me to go and see so-and-so and ask for forgiveness, or just to pick up the phone and say, I love you. you know, that's having nevertheless. And then you're going to see God do what is not logical when you do what doesn't make sense, because God always follows through. I remember when early days when I first got saved, I felt the Spirit of God say, phone your dad, because we didn't live in the same area. I couldn't just get in the car and drive. Phone your dad and tell him you love him. And it was difficult for me to do, because we didn't really do that back then in the day. Look at each other and say, I love you. And I knew he loved me, but I had never looked at him and said, I love you, Dad. And so when I picked up the phone and I phoned him, I felt something broke right there as I did it, and God needed that thing to be broken. And from that time, when I was obedient to do that, my dad became a hugger. And it was easier for him to say, I love you. And it was amazing. But I had to do something that was difficult for me. And I had to say, nevertheless, God, I feel you telling me to do this. I'm going to do it anyway. And I did it. And I saw the fruit of being obedient and saying, nevertheless, I'll do it. The other one is bring God into your everyday. And the little story I've got here in the book of Acts chapter 16, we see a woman by the name of Lydia who was a seller of purple. So in other words, she was a businesswoman, a seller of purple. It was cloth. It was cloth that had to be dyed in a certain way. Apparently only the wealthy people or people who had influence would wear the color purple, because it was quite expensive. And so this woman was a businesswoman, but she made time to gather with other women to pray. That's how she came across Paul and Silas, because they were praying, and she took them to her home, and she had a revival herself. So in the midst of what God has called you to do, you might be a very busy person out there with a 9-to-5 job or longer hours job, and you bring God into what you do in your normal everyday life. You're going to see God active in your normal everyday life. If you want to experience revival or live a life that inspires revival, take God to work with you. Take God to school with you. Live your Christian life out in the marketplace. Don't just live the secret life at home where you pray and then God speaks to you. Take that out with you wherever you go. That's what revival is all about. When people are bringing God into their everyday. Then and this is important, change the lens that you're looking through. What is your expectation? Because some people still feel like they're in this wilderness, they're in this terrible dry place, and they can't see any way out. God is asking you to change the lens so that you see from His perspective. Take off those old glasses you've been wearing for 40 years, or it feels like you've been in the desert for 40 years. Take them off and say, God, I need your perspective. I need your clarity of vision. I need to be able to focus on what you are seeing so I can see what you see. So that's what happens when you change the lens. And a lot of people, when they go through transition, which is a time of change from one place to another in the spiritual realm, God's taking you into a new season. When you go into a new season, you have to see with a different lens. It's a whole new scenario that God is wanting to show you. And a lot of people go into the new season, or they go through transition where they don't understand what they're going through, but God is doing something to get you into the new season. And they're trying to see it with the old lens that belonged in an old season. And so God's saying to you, change the lens today. Go to Him and get new perspective on where He's taking you. And the last thing about, I think it's my last point, when you want to live a life that inspires revival, community is crucial. I've got it here in my book. Have people in your life who see you at your lowest, and they call out the gold in you, because you feel you're still wearing the old lenses, you're still in transition, so you can't see where you're going. You don't feel like you've got any revival going on in your life, and here I'm speaking to you about living a life that inspires revival. Have people around you who call out the gifts that God has in you. They honor and value you because they see God in you. They see God at work in you. And they treat you as though you are already where God said you are going. So have those kind of people in your life. Don't sit at home feeling sorry for yourself and be alone. Get together with someone. Maybe you can't now because of social distancing or lockdown or restrictions. Find somebody to have a FaceTime chat with. Somebody you can trust who knows you and who has seen you at your worst, and they still treat you as though you are at your best. So we need community. We need people in agreement with us. This is it. This is what agreement means. harmony or accordance in opinion or feeling, a negotiated and typically legally binding arrangement between parties as to a course of action, the absence of incompatibility between two things, and it also means consistency. So when you have community in your life, when you have people in your life who see you, who trust you, who value you, they're going to be in agreement with you. You're going to go to them, and like Joshua and Caleb, and you're going to say, God said this. There's a promised land for me. God has promised me this. And they're not going to weep and wail and say, oh, but why? They're going to say, yes, I agree with you. I'm going to agree with you in prayer until we see this thing happen. So community is crucial. So I'll just give you these things again very quickly. Don't apologize for what you believe was number 1. Always have the word nevertheless in your vocabulary was number 2. Bring God into your everyday, number 3. Number 4 was change the lens. And number 5, community is crucial. That's all out of your now season. And so I want you to be encouraged today that God is taking you somewhere, that you are, there is revival for you. God has handpicked you to walk in the revival. And so let the Spirit of God awaken areas in your life that you feel, are you still in the wilderness? This is still too hard. Let the Spirit of God come and blow on those areas and breathe the breath of God in those areas. So be encouraged with that today. Live a life that inspires revival.